Good afternoon and happy Monday. It is just after 12:15 on March 18th. We're here for a state legislation discussion. Before I turn it over to Ms. Wanger, did just want to note that Vice President Stewart is at a Smart Cities conference on an international trade mission with the county executive, so she won't be joining us today. And with that, it's crossover day today, so quite a big day in Annapolis. The purposes of today's conversation is we're going to get an update on the big ticket items that we have been closely monitoring and following. I'm going to suggest that we go through all of the updates and then open it up to questions and discussions. We'll talk about budget, taxes, housing, environment, health and human services, public safety, and juvenile justice. It loosely follows our state legislative priorities. And with that, let me turn it over to Ms. Wanger with thanks to you and your team for all the work that you've been doing on our behalf in the General Assembly in Annapolis. And with that, let me turn it over to you.
Okay, great. Yeah, it's crossover today, so it's a it has been a busy weekend, and it's a busy Monday in Annapolis. So what is crossover? It means that if the House of Origin bills don't get passed to the other house by the end of today, then they end up assigned to the opposite house's Rules Committee, and that requires an additional procedural hurdle to get out and to actually be deliberated on by that opposite house. In fact, it's a pretty big hurdle, actually. I'm going to say that. In the olden days, it used to be a little easier to get those bills out of rules, but it's become, over the years, tougher and tougher. So it's an important day in Annapolis because we start to now really, first we get all the bills in, so we see what's before us, and now you get to see, I think, what's really in play and what's maybe not in play at this point with a couple of weeks left in session. In your packet, I just want to run through what's here. There's an update on the local and bi-county bill package. And that is pretty current because I think that's pretty much settled out at this point. There's a status of all the bills that have been on an agenda that's come to council, and that was last updated like Friday afternoon. So more to come, hopefully tomorrow. I think we'll probably send another update on that. And then there's a listing of the local bond initiatives, which are starting to get worked on, and that list also shows where the county has been named as part of the financing package for those projects. We also have the list of earmarks in the first 6 appropriations bills from the vote that was taken last week on those first 6 bills. And then also tomorrow we're going to send out, a lot of you have been fairly active, sending letters in support or in opposition to pieces of legislation in Annapolis. And we've kind of kept track of all those, and we're going to send out to you where all those bills stand by tomorrow morning, which should, again, kind of be important information, so if they're moving or not moving. So we'll do that for you tomorrow, along with a couple of other updates here. But otherwise, I'm going to kick it off. The budget. So last week, the Senate sent out its operating budget with the Budget Reconciliation Act. There's not a lot there, really. They had a couple of things happen to them. There was a revenue write-down, and also there was an inaccurate estimate of what the Medicaid expenses would be. So the Senate, I think if you read the newspapers, you probably have, has a different feeling than the House on how they're going to manage the budget and revenues this year. So they sent out a budget where they did some fixes. For example, the community colleges, they are getting back about $10 million in funding. The private higher education was hit hard. Some of that money's restored, and then they covered some of these kind of the two things that happened to them, which honestly the Medicaid underestimation was known, but it's a pretty big number. And then a slight revenue write-down. They have a volatility revenue account that they tapped for that, and then also are allowing the governor to use the rainy day fund to cover that Medicaid hit. So it's really a pretty standard budget going out there. The House budget is on the floor, I think, as we speak, probably. And they have a different approach to it because they are interested in Resolving part of their general fund problem largely involves the blueprint funding for the out years. And also they are interested in a larger fix to the transportation funding problems that were upfront and personal to all counties this past fall. So let's see, I think on the 26th, I just presented to you just a list, we didn't go through them, of all of the transportation bills that were out there. And at that time, we really didn't know a lot about the general fund side of things. So there's two pieces of legislation that are being moved by the House of Delegates on the general fund revenue side, which I call it that. And these are largely tagged to help finance the blueprint, which will run into trouble not this year, not next year, but in a couple of years. So they're looking to resolve some of these problems now. And that is an iGaming bill that will be that will be an item that would be on a referendum or petitioned. So it will require a vote of all the people in the November election if this piece of legislation does move and gets out of the Senate. And then another piece of legislation that was part of the fair share tax plan that received some attention, and that is the combined reporting piece out of that. Combined reporting is, addresses a multi-state issue about taxation. The piece of legislation has been in many, many, many years and has not passed. A lot of states do use combined reporting for multi-state corporations, and so the House has selected that as a piece of their tax plan, and that would not that would not be implemented until FY28. So both of these are kind of back-ended, but have a specific purpose. On the transportation side, the Train Commission did make recommendations in the fall about EVs, about registration fees, or ensuring that that those that have plug-ins or electric vehicles that are not paying gas tax or not paying gas taxes to the extent that that others that have gas vehicles are would be responsible for some share of the costs of roads and everything else. So both the House and the Senate had pieces of legislation in on that. They both had toll legislation, and then as a separate note, they had shock trauma legislation since shock trauma was running out of money. So there's, the Senate's been pretty careful. I mean, they've done a piece of shock trauma legislation, they've done EV, they have not touched tolls, but the House has a lot of ideas on this front. They have a registration fee for large vehicles. They have a vehicle excise tax on trade-ins. That's something that went by the wayside probably about 10 years ago, where you were no longer taxed on the differential between your trade-in. You didn't pay the excise tax on that. They have that as part of their package. There's a vehicle excise tax increase from 6 to 6.5%. They also have a piece of trauma legislation. They have a tolling bill that would generate about $750 million that would be paid to the Transportation Trust Fund at $75 million a year for the next 10 years. After the Maryland Department of after the authority makes all of its payments, then it's to do this, which will require obviously an increase in tolls to pay for that. Someone's near and dear to our hearts because we did have a local TNC piece of legislation in that you all supported, and instead it looks like the House is moving a piece of TNC legislation. It's an impact fee. It's a 75-cent impact fee. So I will just say that does not look great for our smaller bill to increase the fee from 25 cents to 50 cents, since they're taking the opportunity to tag on that one. There's increasing registration fees for electric vehicles, and that's kind of the package. I'm not certain if these are going to be individual bills that will move, or if some of these will be included in the Budget Financing Reconciliation Act. So they're pretty far apart. So we'll see what happens in the next week or so. Discussions about how they're going to ultimately resolve these differences and put together a budget and a financing package. And that's budget. That's kind of the money side of things. And then, Leslie, you want to talk about housing?
Sure. So two of the three governors' bills in the governor's package for housing have moved. The tenants' rights bill is on third reader in the House today. That's the one that increases eviction filing fees and offers other protections like a tenant's bill of rights. Establishes the Office of Tenant and Landlord Affairs and DHCD, et cetera. You've heard of that one before. The other one, the Maryland Community Investment Corporation, has also crossed over. And that one establishes a community development entity in the state that would allocate new market tax credits, typically subsidizing up to 20% of a project's capital costs. Those two have moved. The Housing Innovation Pilot Program and Fund has also moved, crossed over to the Senate. This would require a $5 million mandate in the budget each fiscal year, and the purpose of the fund would be to provide counties and housing authorities with low and no interest loans for to develop mixed use and cross-subsidized housing. So that one has also moved, as I said. Interestingly, there's a rental assistance for community schools families fund bill that has moved. It's on third reader in the House today. The Senate bill has crossed over. There's some slight differences, but essentially it takes the concept of a community school from the Kerwin bill and establishes a rental assistance fund for families who qualify for the fund. So for currently a community school has to have a concentration of poverty level of 65%. So if you are in one of those schools and then you otherwise are facing homelessness or housing instability, certain other criteria, you could then access rental assistance for up to 12 months from this fund. So the governor may include $10 million in the fund in the Senate version or an annual appropriation in the House version, and that's partially funded by the increased filing fees in the tenants' rights bill. Just an FYI, the Just Cause bill that has been in for many years has moved out of the House and is in the Senate.